Mike Adenga Center. Welcome to Alliance Française Mike Adenga Center. We are very pleased today to receive again Point of View. This is an ongoing relationship we have with the Benin Foundation. This happens every last Tuesday of every month here at Alliance Française, and this has been a really great collaboration. These talks are very qualitative regarding critical thinking, so I hope you'll enjoy this. This particular talk is very important in Europe right now about restitutions. And also, we are very pleased to welcome a colleague, a friend, Vincent Baden, from the IFRA, the director of IFRA in Ibadan. Thank you. Enjoy.
Thank you very much, Manon. Manon has been fantastic, in our partnership, as we talk about art's role in shaping society positively and also addressing pertinent issues that affect Africa and the world. Well, the Benin Foundation is at the forefront. It's established in the legacy in the name of one of Africa's greatest modernist artists, and programs like this have been established to ensure that we preserve his legacy, and as I said earlier, we promote art and show art's relevance in shaping society. Today's topic will touch especially on the restitution debate. It's themed Africa's Cultural Heritage and the Case for Restitution. And this edition will lend voice to increasing global calls and debates for the repatriation of looted art to Nigeria, more specifically, the renowned Benin bronzes. The talks also seek to discuss current efforts in this direction, Nigeria's state of preparedness in receiving and preserving them, as well as its impact on Nigerian cultural heritage. We've had, this is the 7th in the edition, and we've had 6 previous ones that have been immensely successful. And well, let's just sit back for a moment as we remind ourselves of the first 6 editions. Thank you very much for your attention.
The Benin Foundation is a non-profit organization that aims to promote and preserve the legacy of celebrated Nigerian artist, scholar, educator, administrator, and statesman Benin Womo, while increasing the global appreciation of the visual arts in Africa and our related diaspora. Hinge on advocacy, scholarship, and intellectual engagement, the Foundation's 3-pronged approach involves promoting, fostering, explaining, protecting, and giving prestige to Nwomo's artistic, intellectual, and political legacy, maintaining a diverse, multidisciplinary public program of exhibitions, projects, workshops, talks, and lectures, and promoting cross-cultural ties and exchange between established and emerging artists, designers, and curators through international residencies. Ongoing initiatives include the Benin Distinguished Lectures and Point of View, a monthly series of talks initiated in collaboration with the Society of Nigerian Artists and supported by Alliance Française / Mike Adenga Center Lagos. Point of View interrogates the evolving role of the visual arts in addressing pressing issues affecting Africa and the rest of the world. The talks draw from other creative disciplines and such diverse sectors as government, science and technology to impact policy by raising awareness, advocating for change, and inspiring action. It aims to further encourage support and funding for the visual artists through public and private sector partnership, while ensuring continuing artist professional development and empowerment. On September 17, 2019, the first edition themed A Case for the Artist Resale Land advocated for visual artists benefiting from secondary and downstream sales of their works by seeking to establish an effective system for collecting resale royalties and remunerating artists.
SNA can come up tonight with a draft of what they want in activating Section 13. I promise you by Monday next week, I will take the draft and get ministerial approval of the regulation.
On October 15, 2019, The second edition theme, Raising Capital Against High-Value Works of Art, sought to encourage the growing recognition of Nigerian art as a new alternative asset class while providing a deeper understanding of art as collateral for lending transactions, such as financing business expansions and investments or high-end purchases. It also aimed to support the development of art investment products as well as the diversification of investment portfolios with the integration of art.
The regulatory framework is yet opaque.
All the presentations that you might hear and all the talks that we're giving really do not carry much weight if there's no trust.
On November 22nd, 2019, the third edition themed Museums, Tourism and Urban Development addressed key issues, trends and challenges in Nigeria's cultural tourism sector. Leading architects share their insights on the most innovative construction and design trends using completed, ongoing and upcoming projects as examples. Museum specialists also shed light on improving visitor experiences, preservation and conservation activities, as well as on the challenges they face, while government authorities highlighted investment opportunities and spoke on museum development and destination marketing.
To begin to start the process of remedying the thefts of the 700 works.
And the image on the right is from one of his descendants, Niyi Fakir, and I took that picture because he works at the National Museum.
On January 24, 2020, the fourth edition themed Art as a Driver for Environmental Sustainability advocated for sustainable cities and communities by promoting interdisciplinary collaborations between professionals across the diverse sectors as government, the arts, science and technology. Specifically, it highlighted the significant role of the visual arts in ensuring policy frameworks that address climate change.
We're endowed with about 1.2 billion people, 43% of which are below the age of 15. Is that not staggering?
February 26, 2020, the fifth edition, themed Funding for the Visual Arts, Public and Private Sector Partnership, examined recent developments in public and private sector funding support for the creative arts in Nigeria, with a special focus on the Creative Industry Financing Initiative introduced by the Central Bank of Nigeria in collaboration with the Bankers Committee.
I do finally get to paint and I want to sell. Obviously, I'm not selling to a gallery because I'm not going to wait or go through that whole process. Either I put it on Instagram or I go and find someone who I can sell to directly because I need to pay the bills.
You need to treat art as a business, right? I know there's a place for CSR, but you need to treat it as a business, profit and loss. There has to be a strong case, not just from a business point of view, but also from a CSR point of view.
When I say let's consider art as a business, I'm probably saying for Jubril, we're not saying as a real commercial business, but as an initiative that is not just about dashing somebody money so they can express themselves.
Good product more readily lends itself to financing. So I think artists should go back and focus on quality of what is being produced.
On April 27, 2021, the sixth edition themed New Digital Pathways, Technology, Creating and Marketing Art provided a deeper understanding of how technological advancements like the internet, social media, virtual and augmented reality, blockchain and cryptocurrencies have not only given rise to new forms of art, including non-fungible tokens, but have also disrupted the global art market.
I create my work using Microsoft Word, which makes it digital, right? And what I make essentially is digital art. Just as the person who has a canvas and has acrylic, oil and whatever creates their painting, and that is traditionally created, I create mine digitally, and that is crypto art.
You know, collectors are really the final stage in this whole chain. And I know for some reason Nigeria would like to talk about collectors all the time. But the reality is collectors are the minority with extreme power in this art world.
Do research the artists that I buy. So I've been able to, I have pieces. I have about 85, NFTs, and that's, like I said, primarily artwork. But I also invested in the CryptoPunk space, the metaverse space, so Decentraland, and like this tokenized.
I think that we must look at NFTs as the way we look at many other transaction models. It comes with its risk, right? As much as it does have a lot of benefits, there are definitely risks, and these risks don't necessarily go away because the benefits are huge.
So that has been our journey so far. I hope you all enjoyed it. Next, we have a screening, Rawson's Boat, by a performance artist and also a very internationally renowned artist, Jalili Atiku, who is in the audience, and thereafter he'll take some questions. But let me, for those who may not know him, I'll just do a very brief introduction of the artist. Award-winning artist Jalili Atiku holds a Bachelor's of Arts degree and a Master's of Arts in Visual Arts from the Ahmadu Bello University, Zaria. For decades, his themes have steadily revolved around contemporary African politics with a focus on human rights as well as psychosocial and emotional issues of traumatic events such as violence, war, poverty, corruption, and climatic change. Atiku is widely traveled, performing and speaking on his work across Africa, Europe, South Korea, Japan, and Canada. In 2015, he was honored with the Prince Claus Fund Award for his provoking performances that challenge assumptions and stimulate dialogue in an unconventional and dynamic form of community education, and for his pioneering dedication to establishing space for contemporary performance art in Nigeria. Jalilu Atiku is presently the artistic director of Afri Performer, a collective of performance artists in Africa, and chief coordinator of Advocate for Human Rights Through Art. So that's a very brief bio for Jalili Atiku. If I went longer, we'd probably be here, for most of the day. The screening is of Rawson's Boat, and it's the artist's commentary on the British punitive expedition of Benin, in which several beautiful works of art were carted away, the palace was burnt, and the Oba at that time, Overawan Nobaisi, was banished, and this happened in 1897. So without much ado, we'll start the screening. Please sit back and enjoy it. Thank you.
Me back home. I want to go home. Take me back home. I want to go home. Benin, Edo. Take me back home. 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 Take me back home.
It's a great privilege to stand before you today to talk about my work. I'm particularly happy that one of the persons that inspired the work, who also incidentally was my professor, and that's Professor Pejulaiwala. She's also here. It's a great feelings that you are here today. Well, I produced this work after I happened to saw a work, and that was 2011, if I'm not mistaken. It was in Ibadan, 2010. And the first work I produced was during the Lagos Book and Art Festival, and the German is also here too. So thank you for creating that privilege. As an artist, I understand that one of my roles is to increase the sensitivity of my audience. And at that time, having seen that the installation by Professor Laiwola, I felt so sad. It was traumatizing to know the history, how the British loot some of the works that will have influenced some of a person like me today. And that works were taken out of this country, and they were somewhere where somebody like me could not have the opportunity to see the original. So I had to go into the research to know further what that happened. And incidentally, I got to know that Ronson was one of those that led into the expedition that stole most of the things, most of the legacy that our our ancestors created. So that's why I created that work that I call it Ronson's Boat, trying to metaphoricize the theft, and also to let us understand, and painting my body in the color of that sculpture is to bring you, those who witness the work, in trying to go into the sacredness of this object. Most of the objects were not created because they want to adorn museum. They were created as an element in the spiritual aspect of the people. So it is a connection to them. It is not just like some of us who are in the Isheshe will understand what the object means when it's been taken away from you. This object had energy that have been planted, the sacred energy in them, and they are taken away. So I felt the only way is for me to put myself into that rigor, and Prof was also there during the performance in France, and you also was feeling the cold of that moment that I was. So it was dislocation completely. My body was dislocated during the performance, and I felt it, how the energy in the work itself has been dislocated. So I felt putting my body into that will make all others to know. I'm particularly happy that after the event, there's a lot of discussion about it now, and that France and also some of the museums all over the world have agreed, in quotes, to return this subject. I hope they do, and I hope one day I will go to Benin and be engaged with the work. A lot of people do not understand what that means, that when you are part of an ancestor and part of you is taken to another place and you do not have the opportunity to see them. In 2016, I happened to go to Rietberg Museum, and I saw an original Okpoifa in that museum. I have never in my life seen that kind of Okpoifa in my life. And they gave me the permission to take the photographs, and I brought the photographs to Nigeria. I took it to Ife and some other place, and I asking them questions. That was when I know that the energy, the sacredness of the Ifa itself is feminine energy. And so most of the things that were based on Ifa were as a result of the energy of the feminine body. You could see how that has expanded my knowledge of understanding of the civilization of my ancestors. So immediately after that, I did a performance in 2017 in Venice that I titled Mama Say Make I Dey Go. She did behind me. So it means that having be engaged or confronted with the sacred objects of my forefathers, of my foremothers, it's make me to take my work further. And that's exactly what they were doing to us. They make our civilization be stagnant without us seeing this object. So I believe by the time they bring them back to Nigeria, we will be able to feel happy and we'll be able to understand the feelings that are before us, the energy that have created some of the artistic influence that we have today. So I want to join the forces again. I sang a song the other day in France, and I want to sing it today. It may look somehow, and I know it is some kind of, to us in Yoruba here, is an abusive word, but that is what I have been singing. I say, Oju ole re, ole, Oju orole, ole. Let them bring back our things. It belongs to us. Nobody should ask us whether we have space to keep them. That is none of their business. When you stole something, it is just immoral that you stole something and you are now asking the person that you don't have a space to keep it. Let me say keep it. It sounds somehow. Those objects were stolen from Benin. Benin people have been traumatized by it. And some of us who are contemporary artists have been traumatized by the absence of this object. I believe they will return them back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chuku. Sorry, does the audience have a few questions for him? Does anyone have questions, please?
I'm just curious about the reasoning behind the undressing towards the end of the performance.
The what?
The undressing at the end of the performance. Why did the sculpture do that? Why did the performer do that?
Thank you. But you know, we're talking about dislocation, and most of these objects are part of the body of an artist that I left them behind because they are not, I cannot even bring them. I cannot travel with them like that to Nigeria. And so it is in the museum now, and that's exactly what the connection between the poetry that I bring me back home was trying to say. They have to return them. They stole them. So those objects is a symbolic way of saying you still have some part of us that are with you. You have to bring them back to where they belong to. I mean, here in Nigeria, the objects are still there in Paris. I mean, in France. So they need to bring them back. So that is what I'm trying to do with that.
It's not a question per se. I just wanted to know if you are aware that there are replicas of some of these objects still in Benin, specifically at the Gung Palace, where the Bronze Guild is located.
Well, thank you so much. That's a different thing entirely. The original object that was taken away passed through a lot of rituals that a lot of people don't talk about. The rituals are the sacred part of that you cannot repeat it. It doesn't matter. You are looking at the physicality of a replica. You know, I am standing beside you. I am Jelili. You cannot replicate me. The same thing as each of these objects that were taken away that went through processes of sacredness. So those ones you see, actually, well, of course, the one that did, and also you also will agree with me that, I don't know whether they still do it, I can't say about that, but there has been a lot of indoctrination into the practice of what happened right now because of Christian belief and also colonialism. But the one that we are taking away do not have any influence from it except that of the Benin culture, the Benin religion that is passed through series of rigorous rituals that were not known to the outside people except that was done in the inner parts of the religion. So those ones that you see are the replica, like you said, they're actually not the one that were taken away. So which is different. the energy of it cannot be the same as the energy that we should think you are saying. Well, I may be wrong, but I think Prof is here to say more about that when it comes to that. But I'm speaking from the aspect of the religion itself that produce that energy, that sculptural piece you're saying. Of course, that day when we did have the project there, we took a lot of pictures. I still have a lot of pictures of them. I also bought some of it that I use in my other performances, but that is not the same as that. Like you said, the replica, the word replica is still really questionable. You want to ask more questions about that?
So before the invasion, when the Oba wanted to capture an occurrence, so a lot of these objects were not necessarily made for the shrines. I'm from Benin. So a lot of the objects were made to capture moments. So they were kind of documenting history. And the guild members, the bronze casters, before they would cast, they always try to cast more than one object. So they cast 2 or more objects, and they give the best to the Oba, and they keep the remaining. When the invasion happened, members of the guild hid a lot of these other objects. I was just asking you if you had visited the guild's palace in Igun to check these other objects there. That's all I was asking.
Okay, yeah, I was at Igun with the Prof. But I keep saying also, well, this is also questionable. But some of us can argue it, and I don't think today is the day for us to talk about whether most of those objects that you find in the museum are actually objects of documentation. Because that is the way they want us to see it, that they are also objects that the king used to document. We're not like the European people who sometimes use their power to do some things. We are surely, like Benin, are surely the king is the sacredness of everything that happened there connect with the sacred part of the body. Well, like I said, the Prof is here, we will talk more about that. And I think in another forum, we will explain further about what I'm trying to say about the sacredness of those objects. So the one that was hidden by the artists at that time might actually be different. But I think, like I said, when Prof want to say, we'll talk more about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jalilu Atiku. I'm sure you'll agree with me, it was very enjoyable and very informative, very insightful as well. I think with that, we can go to our first presentation, and it's titled The British Museums, the Benin Bronzes, Colonial Violence, and Cultural Restitution. Let's sit back and enjoy an introduction of the speaker. Thank you.
Dan Hicks is a professor of contemporary archaeology at the University of Oxford, a curator at the Pitt River Museum, and a fellow of St. Cross College, Oxford. Hicks works on the material and visual culture of the human past, up to and including the modern, colonial, contemporary, and digital world, and on the history of archaeology, anthropology, art, and architecture. Dan Hicks has made several radio and TV appearances and authored many books, including The British Museum, The Benin Bronzes, Colonial Violence, and Cultural Restitution. He has also written for a variety of journals, magazines, and newspapers like the Times Literary Supplement, Apollo Magazine, Art Review, ArtNet, The Guardian, The Telegraph, and The Independent. Ladies and gentlemen, please let's welcome Professor Dan Hicks.
Okay, wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful to be here. Thanks so much for that introduction. I'm just going to share my screen. So I hope you can all see that. And absolutely wonderful to be here, as I say, speaking to you actually from here in Oxford. Hopefully, are you able to hear me now? Right, okay, great. So wonderful to be here. And so I'm here in Oxford, speaking to you from the museum about which I wrote a book and where I have been working for the past 14 years or so. So in the time available to me, I want to tell you a little bit about the arguments that are in the book, but also to set it in some context as well. So for those of you unable to visualize the Pitt Rivers, here is the museum. It's a Victorian institution founded in 1884. It contains hundreds of thousands of objects from around the world, and it includes over 100,000 from Africa as a continent, and many of those are Nigerian objects. So my role as a curator is to keep the museum in a lot of ways, the same, to make sure that the moths aren't eating the fabrics and the ironwork isn't sort of rusting away. But at the same time, a lot of people in my role as a curator have imagined their role also to involve trying to ensure the world around the museum does not change. However, here at Oxford, the world around us really has changed over the past sort of years. So I really want to tell you a little bit about that. But first, maybe underlining the logic of the Pitt Rivers, which is a named museum. It was an institution founded by Augustus Henry Lane Fox Pitt Rivers, who was a soldier and a collector, but also a theorist. And, really this image sums up his sort of theory over objects. It is, if you like, a diagram of the evolution of the wooden stick. So in the middle, you have a hypothetical wooden stick, and then moving out in these different areas to the right and to the left and so on, you can see the shields on the right hand side and the lances at the bottom and the boomerangs on the left hand side. So all of those are objects from a single culture, in this case Aboriginal Australia, which he argued over time, if you like, evolved. That objects were constantly improving. They were constantly getting better. On the surface of it, this is an argument which is a very standard Victorian sort of improvement narrative, the idea that the world is constantly getting better. But for our purposes, we have to highlight two things about it for the Pitt Rivers. One is that it's a narrative that relates improvement of objects to violence and to weaponry. And a second is that, of course, at the height of the cultural evolution that's argued for here would be, Victorian Oxford. So this was a cultural supremacist argument at the same time. So it was not a surprise in many ways, although it certainly was to me, sort of working here at the museum, that in 2015, the Rose Must Fall Oxford movement sort of, if you like, observed over social media that the Pitt Rivers Museum is one of the most violent spaces in Oxford. For us at the museum, that was a shock. We hadn't thought of our museum as anything to do with violence. We had thought of ourselves as absolutely trying to face up to the legacies of empire, but we didn't think it hadn't occurred to us that the displays in the present could be violent and hurtful to our audiences, but also to those who are unable to visit the museum. So the Rose Must Fall Oxford movement, of course, emerged out of the Rose Must Fall movement in Cape Town, where in 2015, actually there was a generation of undergraduates who were born after the end of apartheid, after it ended in 1994. They were 18 or 19 years old. And in 2015, they found themselves at a university where institutional racism was there in the present. And absolutely centrally to that, was an image of Rhodes, the famous colonialist, and the mass murderer, and the diamond miner, the founder of the South Africa Company. He was at the heart of campus. An image of him was there to memorialize his worldview. So for the students and faculty who were involved in this movement, the physical dismantling of the white infrastructure of Rhodes, where actually art had been put to work to make that violence last and to allow the worldview of his to be naturalized, to be normalized, that had to be removed. So in the fall of 2015, actually a number, because of the Rhodes Fund that's there to fund students from across Africa, North America, and elsewhere in the world to come to Oxford every year, a number of those who had been involved in this movement actually arrived in Oxford and found another image of Rhodes here at the heart of the academy outside Oriel, which is a college in Oxford. So the Rhodes Must Fall Oxford movement started pointing out that in our institutions in the University of Oxford, there were a whole set of ways in which imperial thinking, imperial figures had been sort of made to last. There were memorials to the Caribbean slave traders. There was the Old Indian Institute. But at the heart of this actually was us at the Pit Rivers. And it wasn't the displays of weaponry that I mentioned earlier that were at the heart of what was being said to be violent. It was the court art sort of case of the objects that were looted in 1897. Because here at the Pit Rivers, we hold about 150 of the more than 10,000 objects that were looted in 1897. So here is the case in the museum. I'm actually talking to you only about 25 yards away over there from this case. And so I just want to tell you a little bit about what we are talking about when we talk about 1897. So as I'm sure a lot of the audience know, this was the attack led not really under the later colonial circumstances, but under the protectorate and through the agency of the Royal Niger Company. So we heard earlier about Rawson, who led this naval attack. But actually the company, the Royal Niger Company, was the West African version of the South Africa Company led by Rhodes. So the Goldie-led company was obviously seeking at this time to expand its interests in rubber and in the palm oil industries. And the Oba was one of a number, and the book sort of goes into all this, was one of a number of the local powers which he sought to remove because he was in the way. But it wasn't only, if you like, a history of the ongoing attacks from all the way from 1884 with the Berlin Conference, where the Europeans set out to carve up Africa, and all of those interventions and the military attacks that happened from 1884 actually up until 1914. It wasn't only that, it was also in this case the looting of art, which was a central part of what the British were doing in seeking to destroy sovereignty, seeking to destroy traditional religion, but also to undertake the dispossession of sort of culture and of heritage. So a lot of these objects included more than 12,000 of these things, the relief, the reliefs or plaques that tell the history. We heard earlier it was raised that these objects are archives of the unwritten history of the court life as it evolved over 500 years. Because let's obviously understand that the Benin kingdom was one of the great West African urban civilizations, of this period, that the Oba, when he was deposed, was actually one of a long and unbroken line that reached back actually earlier than Elizabeth I, and that artistic work, which was sacred and was royal inside the palace areas, had been ongoing over all of those years. So certainly there were these objects, there were those images, but and of course we can see those at the British Museum, those of us who are able to get to London easily. But on the right-hand side, again, we see the Pitt Rivers objects that reminds us of the wider diversity of items that were taken. So the obers' heads, such as we see in the middle, the carved ivory tusks, as we see at the bottom and at the right-hand side, the other forms of the figures, such as the leopards and the hornblowers, and the famous Idia masks as well, just to give you some examples. There are also work in wood, coral work and pottery that were taken at that time. Here is a rare image of one of the altars, actually in the palace in 1891, so before this attack, that just reminds us of the sacred nature of these items. It shows us how the carved ivory tusks were put actually into the head of each of the obers to tell the histories again of all of the achievements of that ober and the history of the royal court. We've got the bells along the front and the figures at the back. So what the British were doing was really a sacrilegious, it was a desecrating act. So many of you may have seen the image on the right-hand side here of the looters with their loot in front of them, which is from an image that we hold here at the Pitt Rivers. Less well known is this image on the right-hand side that shows the same man in the pith helmet actively burning the place down. So it was not for nothing that the Hague Convention of 1899 actually listed a series of things that the British had done in that attack, and that they were against that code. They underlined that you should not actually undertake the massacre of innocent villagers or people in the towns, because such a wide area was simply razed to the ground. It underlined that you should not loot, that you should not actively attack religious sites. And even the filing down of the bullets that was done in order to increase the impact upon the body for the thousands and the tens of thousands who were killed, even that was outlawed in the Hague Convention of 1899. So we have to remember that 1884 was the founding of the Pitt Rivers Museum, of the Berlin Conference. It was also the year of the invention of the Maxim, which was the machine gun that was really at the heart of this. So think back to the logic of the Pitt Rivers with the evolution of the weaponry. Here was a point in history where the weaponry that the British had, the 35 Maxims, which were alongside the rocket launchers and the barbed wire and electric lighting and the field sort of guns, the mountain guns, all of those were the weaponry, the arsenal of the hyper-modern sort of warfare technologies that would find their ways to the soils of Europe in the 20th century, that were being experimented with in Nigeria at this time. So crucially, restitution is not a thing that someone just thought up last week. It isn't a European concern. It's an African-led movement, it's a Nigerian-led movement that in the case of the Benin objects reaches back as early as 1938. And so in 1938, Oba Okenza II received the first of the returns of the coral work in the form of the crowns and the robe. Here you see him alongside officials from the UK, actually in a restitution overseen by London and the BM and the British Museum. So the campaigning from Nigeria continued, especially from the royal court around the 100-year anniversary that fell in the 1990s. And in the UK, the campaigning by Bernie Grant hand in hand in order to seek to amplify the voices from the royal courts, actually was here in the UK an enormously important moment. And so many said that movement around the 100-year anniversary failed. But as we approach the 125th anniversary, which falls in the February of next year, for a lot of people, that movement is finally starting to bear fruit. So I'm not going to tell you about all of the technical language and the theoretical material that's in the book, but it certainly seeks to make a contribution which is conceptual as well as factual, for how, as art historians, anthropologists, archaeologists, we can theorize how it is the museum was sort of put to work for the purposes of white supremacy at this time, at a time at which, in the anthropology museums, human remains were put on display to tell the racist narrative, the racist lie that there are different sorts of human beings. So after the Second World War here at the Pitt Rivers, those displays were removed, but the cultural displays that displayed objects that were taken, objects that were demanded to be returned, that were there to tell the same account of a cultural supremacy, they were not touched until this moment. So I just want to conclude actually by making some points about how this relates to the historical sort of times in which we find ourselves now. So I've argued, and the book argues, that the taking of artworks, the destruction of culture, the dispossession of sacred and royal, objects of such significance was a form of anti-Black violence, was there to justify empire, was there to make empire last. So how can we think about this? How can people like me in these incredibly white institutions in the UK, how can we understand actually what we can do next? How we can frame the importance for returns. And so my colleague Nick Mizof, in writing about the BLM movement, not in its most recent form in 2020, but from 2014 to 17, after the racist murders of Eric Garner and Michael Brown, makes the very important point about the politics of the BLM movement. So the Black Lives Matter movement, he argues, actually emerged, and this is important for all of us that love art, that sort of know, that are interested in visual culture. That movement emerged out of a shift in visual technology. So the dashcam footage and cell phone footage that could be made and shared suddenly made visible anti-Black violence that had been happening for centuries. And that, I want to add to that by saying that fast forward to this year, and last month at the verdict over George Floyd, where the Minnesota Attorney General made the point that the verdict of murder was not actually a justice, because anything looking like justice implies true restoration, but it is accountability, and accountability is the first step towards something like justice, repair, and healing. So the version of that I argue from a curatorial position means that what some are calling the decolonization of museums, and what I prefer to see as the unfinished work of anti-colonialism and anti-racism in our institutions, in these museums, which we're trying to make fit for the 21st century. What that work looks like is surprisingly like the banal, ordinary work of the work of a curator, making lists. It's the saying of names. It's the shining of a light. It's the sharing of the footage. The version of that, and what I do in the book, in the appendix, is I make the first list, or the first attempt at a list, in a long time, to say where are all of the 10,000 objects, which are the collections they're in. And it turns out they're in more than 40 institutions here in the UK. They're in more than 38 in America, including 5 of the Ivy League schools. They're in Ireland, they're in Canada, they're in Russia, they're in the United Arab Emirates. And the full sort of list is in the appendix of the book. What the book seeks to do is to break down the old argument that restitution is something that Nigerians want and that the curators in museums say no to. Already in our museums, restitution is a normal part of our work in terms of Holocaust restitution, in terms of the return of ancestral human remains, you know, in the case of the North American indigenous communities or the Maori. Why not for cultural remains? Why not for African returns, for Nigerian returns as well? And so the book seeks to try to catalyze a conversation in between audiences and the directors and the curators and the trustees and the wider communities in each of the 160 institutions that hold the Benin bronzes. And alongside the historic work that's come from Nigeria to campaign for this, and alongside the current work of the Germans and so many other actors, we're starting to see movement from Germany, movement from the University of Aberdeen, from the National Museum Ireland, from the Fowler Museum at UCLA. And even the Times of London, the newspaper, after the announcement of the returns from Aberdeen, altered its editorial line. And this is, I think, one of the most significant moments from a UK perspective, is that the Times said that this was the right thing actually to do. So you can read a bit more about this in the book. That's a very short version of a long argument. You can look at some of the conceptual ideas in the links there for the arts historians among you, but I hope that's a useful overview of what the book seeks really to do. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Hicks. Now it's time for a few questions. Let's ask him a couple of questions. Let's say about 2 or 3. Thank you very much.
Hello. Thank you very much. My name is Tunde Arugumati. My question kinds of tallies with what Mr. Jalili alluded to earlier about the significance of most of these treasures, of these artifacts, right? And in as much as they have been used, well, commercially, for education, for all forms of enterprise out there, when they return there, is there some kind of arrangement on, because he also mentioned that there was some contextual meaning to them, that, and that's why they couldn't be replicated beyond physical duplication. So how can this context be brought into alignment with modern day life, in as much as most of the elements of the artifacts, as he was alluding to, have been lost along the way, which has kind of truncated civilization from our point of view. And I'd also like to ask that of some of the academic people here too, at this seminar, what arrangements are in place on receiving them back and also putting them back into context in the society in which they are returned to. That's basically my question. Thank you.
Absolutely. So thank you so much for. It's a really, really important issue. So I think the first thing we have to say is that they are not in their context now. They're not. One argument the book puts is that the taking of these objects was not moving them into a new context or kind of adding to their life history. It was taking away. So for as long as these objects remain here in the Pit Rivers, actually, the majority around the world are not even on display. Even the British Museum, which has a little over 900 objects that were taken in 1897, only 100 of those are even on display at the moment. So we're talking about objects out of context in the storerooms, with nobody accessing them, with nobody actually caring for them. I think the potential of re-inscribing context upon them is something that absolutely, it's a very exciting process that can start as the Europeans and Americans remove themselves from this conversation. We hand ownership back, and we allow the fate of these objects, the meaning of them, to be reimagined, as a part of a Nigerian conversation. And I know just from conversations with artists and other colleagues, how much inspiration, how much a surprising range of contexts, as well as the very significant spiritual, religious, and heritage side of their meaning. There's so much inspiration for filmmakers and for poets and for, designers and so on. So I think that notion of context and adding a new context and reimagining the meaning of these iconic objects, that's a process that can only commence, after the process of return actually gets going.
Do we have one more question? Please go ahead. Yes.
If it's one more, then she should.
Okay.
Thank you very much. My name is Jumoke Sanwo, and my question is, I'm quite curious about the return of the objects, and also what happens to the digital assets created off the objects. Who takes ownership of those?
Okay, thanks. Yes, it's a really... So as the book says, one thing the British actually did in Benin was they took objects, but they also took photographs. They photographed themselves. So we have not only objects, but photographs, which are, of course, now in digital form, and diaries and even watercolors were made. So there's a wide range of sort of kinds of digital assets that we can think of. So my own view is that restitution involves the unconditional and permanent return of all aspects of these items. And so you'll hear some people who will argue in a very nostalgic way to say they want to make a replica of the thing that they stole before it being returned. I'd say even the replicas that we hold in the Pyramids, because we do have a number of casts of some of the items we hold and some items elsewhere. There's a whole range of sort of casts that were made over the years, and the digital copies are just another layer, if you like, in that history. Actually, in all of these cases, the agency has to be handed back, and the ownership has to be handed back. So I don't think, of course, that actually means that those involved in the receipt of these assets will not sort of choose to allow them to continue to have an international role, to loan objects physically, to see the digital side of of these artworks, to continue to have an international life. But the key thing is, that the British and the Americans and the Germans need, as they are now starting to remove their control, their interference in that process. So the digital world offers so many exciting potentials for reimagining what a museum is, for reimagining, the digital assets that go alongside the physical assets. And I think the Nigerian case, the Benin case, actually offers a real opportunity for leadership to be shown for how restitution can involve the digital as well.
Thank you very much. One last question, please.
Thank you very much. I'm curious, you mentioned a few things. Agency is one of the things you mentioned, and white supremacy. So if we go back to time, we know that white supremacy is mainly the white man. And when we look at the industry today, whether it be the art space or whether it be academia, it's led by the white man. And a lot of the conversations globally are led by white men. So, yes, you sound like an ally, and I would say based on a few things I know about your work, you present as an ally. When does the conversation change where white allies begin to take themselves out of space to allow the necessary people take up space? Because there's so many professors world over who are capitalizing socially off our narratives. And these narratives are still very much in the margin. And you lot remain in the center, speaking very loud for us, still in the margin. So when do we begin to centralize our margins and allow us space to actually get into the center and take up space? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's a really, really important point, and I'll try to do it justice. So I work in an incredibly white institution, in an incredibly white sector, in an incredibly white university. And the question for anti-racism in this institution is whether whether it's something that everyone has to be involved in. I happen to have a particular esoteric knowledge of what's in this museum, which I am aiming to share and to make that information available. So absolutely precisely, I can undermine myself, I can extract myself from the conversation and not actually take up the space exactly as you say. That doesn't mean, though, I think, that the perspective from the Pit Rivers, from the 150 objects here, and the intellectual case and the case here should not be there in the book. So the next move has to be to, as we are doing, the positive action studentships that are trying to create a pipeline to diversify the museum sector here in the UK, the questions over who speaks on these issues. So my intervention is actually meant to be just one to disrupt the white supremacy of this institution from my perspective, but exactly as you say, to remove myself from the conversation at that appropriate moment, and to see this as a Nigerian-led, sort of issue. But at the moment, all of the information is here with me, so I'm simply trying to be honest about that and to be transparent and to share what I've been trained in, to use my expertise to try to break down the curatorial authority that used to exist, and to say that actually all the decisions over the fate of these objects, the knowledge of them, has absolutely not to lie with those sort of like me who historically have been dominant in this in these institutions. So I hope that answered the question. It's a very important question. I totally agree.
Thank you very much. And I think with that last question, I want to say a very big thank you to Professor Dan Hicks for that very brilliant presentation. I have a copy of his book, and it's exceptional. I have read it. It's very interesting, very incisive, and he's a very good voice on this issue of restitution. Once again, the title of the book, The British Museums, the Benin Bronzes, Colonial Violence and Cultural Restitution. You can get a copy on Amazon at any time. But if you want to borrow a leaf from me, I'm happy to share in my own book. Thank you very much, Professor Hicks. And with that, we move on to our second presentation. And it's a very important Nigerian professor of visual art and my own professor. But I won't say too much about that. Let the introduction come from the video, and then you can learn more about her great exploits. Thank you.
Beju Laiwola is a professor of art and art history at the University of Lagos and president-elect, and Vice President of the Arts Council of the African Studies Association. An accomplished artist, she is listed as a 21st century avant-garde in the book Art Cities of the Future, published by Phaidon Press. An advocate for the repatriation and restitution of looted artifacts, Laiwola is focused on personal and communal history with Benin Kingdom as a focal point. She also founded the Women and Youth Art Foundation, an organization committed to empowering women, young girls and youth through the arts. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Peju Laiwola to the stage.
Thank you so much. The topic I've been assigned to speak on is titled Benin Massacre, Memories and Experiences, which is the title of an article that was published in the catalog of one of the most important exhibitions on Benin, arts titled Benin Kings and Rituals, Court Arts from Nigeria, held in Vienna. It moved to Paris and then Berlin and Chicago over a 2-year period. And about 320 Benin works, Benin objects were shown in that exhibition. And in a sense, this exhibition ignited a cry for restitution. In that article, I argued that the facts and fiction of the 1897 British expedition are imprisoned in the emotive language of subjective historicity. The narrative of 1897 event is usually caught up in a set of tempered text of words and phrases. When written about by Western scholars, words are carefully selected in describing the looting of Benin priceless artifacts, such as taken away, removed, or British protectorate to legitimize control over the Benin region, or even the now less popular description of the word, punitive expedition to describe the sack of Benin. Benin tangible heritage was not simply taken away, they were violently looted from the palace of the Oba of Benin. I also looked at the concept of remembrance and how the Edo choose to remember or recall events. The brass casters, who belong to the guild, known as Igoemo, cast their ideas in history in brass. So the Benin phrase, Sayama, to cast in brass, means to preserve for future use, to remember. And this remembrance or recall of history, so they cast in brass, which is it doesn't rust. It doesn't have. It's a non-ferrous metal, and so memories of the community were preserved for posterity. The artist kept alive the memory of the people. The fact that Benin is renowned today is principally dependent on the arts and rich traditions of its people. Artists played and continue to play a major part. So rather than bore you with an article that is already in public domain, I would rather choose to explore the overarching theme of imperialism, art, and the case for restitution. Much of what we see today as a breakthrough in the clamor for the restitution of Benin tangible material derives from persistent pressure mounted on the keepers of these looted art, which include several requests which were made by members of the Edo royal family, starting as far back as 1935. Oba Kenzwa, His Royal Majesty, Oba Kenzwa II, requested for 2 stools were in the Berlin Museum to be returned to Benin, and it took 2 years, 1937, for plastic cast to be given to him, which he paid for. He paid about 1,500 rich marks for the 2 stools, because he recognized the importance of those tools in palace rituals. And also, beyond the request, we also have critical writings, and I must acknowledge the writings of Kwame Okpoku, a lawyer and well-known advocate for the return of looted African objects, who has consistently written and responded to obnoxious theories against non-restitution. Artists have also played a major role in this struggle, and I will discuss the work by some African artists, mainly Nigerians, as well as my works in the larger context of drawing attention to this period of historical injustice. 2003 brought me in contact with Bernard Moulet, a French anthropologist who initiated the Broken Memory Project. What the loss of objects meant to the communities from where they were looted and how meanings change when the art or objects are moved to new locations. And so I conducted several surveys at Iguemo, with the Guild of Casters in Igu, and realized that a lot of the casters whose ancestors produced the Benin objects under contestation used a lot of printed materials, also looked for images on the internet, and I described these as artificial filters to access their heritage. So our findings were presented in Paris and in Zurich. And it was at the Paris presentation I met Barbara Plackesteiner, the curator of the Benin Kings and Rituals exhibition in 2003. I attended the Vienna exhibition, and in 2009, I gave the closing lecture for the exhibition at the Art Institute of Chicago. And in Vienna, the exhibition brochure, the King, His Royal Majesty Oba Eridawa, requested that the Benin cultural objects should be returned. The King's brothers, who were delegates to the event, spoke about how nostalgic it was for them to view the works taken from their great-grandfather's palace on display. The visitors to the Vienna exhibition were excited about the beauty and artistry of the Benin sculptures. The violent history was lost on them. I returned to Nigeria feeling I needed to respond to this exhibition, particularly as there was nothing in the Nigerian press at the time that referred to this blockbuster event that had traveled to 4 major cities in the global north. That response was my solo show, Benin1897.com, Art and the Restitution Question, the first exhibition in Nigeria to focus on the theme of art pillage from Benin in Nigeria. It brought back discussions in the Nigerian public, and the papers were awash with previews and reviews of the exhibition. The foreword of the exhibition brochure was written by His Royal Majesty Oba Kenzo II, Oba Eridawa I, and we also had a lot of appendices, letters that were written by members of the royal family, as well as government officials in cultural parastatals. As the title of the exhibition, 1897, were Benin, which is the location, 1897, the date, and .com, which underlines commerce as the main Benin was sacked. And it also talks about the commodification of Benin objects. Benin art forms, Benin works are being sold at auctions without recourse to members of the royal family or even to Nigeria. So ownership moved from being the heirloom of the Oba of Benin to being the heirloom of the British soldiers, showing up at auctions and in bank vaults. For several decades, the actual number of collected Benin objects have been somewhat shrouded in secrecy. Works in storage remain in unopened boxes and are inaccessible to the public. What is being requested are the artifacts that survived the onslaught of the Benin fire that engulfed the palace, where some Benin objects were also destroyed. So the British soldiers actually laid siege in the palace of the king, and on the 3rd day, the palace was gutted in fire, and some of the works were also destroyed. In fact, some of the ivories in the collection of Western museums still show the mark of the burns and the pain of the 1897 event. So I was going to go back to show you the image of the bronze heads, in the exhibition. And at the time, we're looking at the number as 3,000 to 4,000 objects. But now Danix tells us that it's an update. It's about 10,000 works that were removed from Benin. So what I did was to put out 1,000 terracotta heads, which actually covered the entire gallery space to show you the scale of the theft that went on in Benin City. So what I did basically here was to try to introduce some oxides onto the terracotta heads as a kind of design to give variation in the installation, but at the same time was also a comment on the fire that engulfed the palace where some of the works were burnt. The next slide shows us the work titled Checkered History, where I took some of the textures from the Benin plaques and put them in a checkered form to, like a checkerboard, like a playground. Benin became a playground for Western powers. And this is very similar to the work done by Yinka Shonebare, the Scramble for Africa, where we had a lot of mannequins around the table, showing how Africa was divided amongst colonial powers. So we'll go on to the next slide. And so this is a work titled Theater of War. And it shows, I actually used this as a way of documenting the history, as the way it was written by the British soldiers, because they wrote a lot about what transpired, the amount of ammunition that were expended on a normal day, on a particular day, the number of houses that were burned. As they made their way into the city of Benin, they burnt a lot of the villages, were set ablaze, they opened fire, the number of people that were killed, and all of the commands that went between here and the Home Office. So these are some of the things that were written down, and the next slide shows is a kind of satire of the images that were shown earlier by Dan Hicks. So we'll go on to the next slide. I titled this Long Live the King, and in this work I was trying to show gourds, which are actually receptacles for keeping things like sacrificial material. But I was looking at the very delicate material and trying to link it up with the enduring nature of kingship. And we had about, at the time, 113 gourds, each gourd representing a year since the expedition. And 17 of those gourds at the bottom were painted plain without any patterns to represent the period of interregnum when the king was exiled to Calabar and there was no king on the throne. So the next slide. Another project which I did, whose centenary project in 2014, and I tried to involve other artists as well in this iteration which held in Benin City at Igun Street, and I invited poets, photographers, photographers. We had video artists, on-site artists as well, who were involved in this project. One of them is also here. Well, two of them are here. Bronze is here, and Jalili Atiku. So we'll go on to the next slide. And some of the images from the performances that went on. Jalili had a performance titled Holy Ovorame Cathedral. And what it did was to dispose of the Christian relics, and it took some of the bronze works, which were done by the Guild of Casters, and used them as a symbol of his church, and invited people to come worship with him. And this performance was done along the streets of Benin, but he actually did majority of the service on a ground that's doubled as a ground for crusades, and sometimes when the crusades are not holding, they also use that spot for pouring the metal. The casters use that for pouring the metal. And then my mother, who was in performance with Wura Natasha Ogunji, Bonds, Effiong Bonds, who came all the way from Calabar. He belongs to the family who took care of Ovorame, who was exiled to Calabar, who died in 1914. So for him, it wasn't performance, it was actually performing a duty, using the umbrella as a symbol of nurture, and showing some of the houses that the king appeared in or lived in Calabar. And then very similar, the poet who performed her poem titled No Answer, as a reference to the number of letters that have been written to museums and totally ignored by the request for the art. So we'll go on to the next slide, which shows Victor and the performance by Jalili Atiku. The next slide. So the first work, the installation I had, 1897, which was done in 2010, I took this to Benin. For me, it was very important that this was going back to Benin. It was a form of catharsis for me. And I used the corridors of the head of the Guild of Casters. So, and it was an open space, so people had time to interact with the works and ask questions about it. And I think this is quite important when we think about the concept of a museum in Africa or in Nigeria. We don't want to rehash the kind of museums that we have in the Western world, because the different setting that we have here, we must think about how we can engage with the community. and get people to engage with these works in ways that are different from having them behind glass cases. So we'll go on to the next slide. Oh, please, the previous one, the previous slide. For this installation, it wasn't just my works that were displayed. We also had the works of the Guild of Casters. I invited them to bring in their bronze works, and they did that. They put in their works there. And this was the first time we had that kind of collaboration between academically trained artists and artists that were trained in a particular canon. It's very unusual. You know, if you grew up in Benin, you know that it's a highly patriarchal society, and that the Guild of Casters are really very secretive about the work that they do, and they really do not have interactions or work with other artists, particularly female artists, because it was taboo for women to cast bronze in Benin. So the next work shows, the next slide shows a work that I did in South Africa. And again, to talk about the widespread expropriation, it wasn't just limited to Benin alone. There were expeditions in the Ashanti region in Ghana, and a lot of gold works were taken away, as well as Ethiopia. So we had images of, it's not a very clear image, but we had images of Coptic crosses, manuscripts from Ethiopia. And because this was done in South Africa, we also engaged with the history of human remains, the story of Sarah Batman. So beyond all of these, there are other artists who have been involved in showing their works, you know, in the context of clamoring for the return of Benin objects. And if you look at the next slide, we have cartoons that were inspired by my exhibition in 2010 by Jimo Ganiu. He did a series of cartoons which are at present showing in the museum, RJ Museum in Cologne. And there are actually two of them. The second one, which is the next slide, which is titled Double Standard, talks about, you know, the way Africans are also treated outside of, you know, the shores. So we have Monday Midnight, a Belgium-based Nigerian singer who produced the musical video 1897. It's quite interesting to see that on YouTube. He shot this in front of Buckingham Palace. And of course, we saw Jalili's Rosin Boat, which was inspired by the exhibition I had in 2010, and which had performed in many other places as well. And we saw recently 200 posters that were of Benin art in Western collections that were exhibited by Emeka Ogbo in the city of Dresden early this year. And in 2015, my work titled Columns of Memory, take the next slide, please, was featured in a group exhibition titled Artificial Facts and Boundary Objects in Kunsthaus Dresden in Germany. So that's the performance we saw much earlier. And so I'm just going to end with a few points. You can go on to the next slide. That's the work in Dresden. Yeah. It's interesting to see several museums willing to return Benin objects. The Germans have taken the lead in this return effort, and the visit of the German team to Nigeria last week to consolidate plans for the return of our treasures is long awaited. So the establishment of a museum in Benin is also a very welcome development. Benin treasures can now be found spread over 160 museums around the world. Those in private collections still remain largely unknown. These objects should be returned unconditionally. There should be no place for any agreement that seeks to loan back objects to their original owners. And in thinking about the concept of the museum, we must be ingenious in conceptualizing an African museum that will not be rehashing the Western model. Museums in the West were set up for a different purpose as an extension of empire. Objects were not kept to be viewed behind showcases. They were meant to be activated during festivals and other cultural events. And so we can, like Dan Hicks said, that these artworks will inspire a great number of artistic productions, film, and all of that that's already going on. But there must be a new way of thinking to create greater appeal for younger audiences and people. Again, restitution is different from a mere return. There ought to be an apology, in my view, for the sort of violence unleashed in Benin. The killing, the burning of cultural sites, and looting of thousands of Benin treasures actually demands some form of apology. And I also think that there should be cooperation between the Benin monarchy, the Edo State government, and the federal government in deciding how best to preserve these objects when they are returned. I've always maintained that these works actually were the heirloom of the king of Benin. They were taken from the bedchamber, they were taken from the shrines of the palace, and somebody asked a question about the relevance of these works in Nigeria today. When Danik showed the image of the regalia returned to Oba Akenza II, those items of regalia were not taken to any museum. They were actually assimilated into the sartorial traditions of the palace. And in 2014, when Adrian Walker returned 2 objects, they were also taken into the palace. So these objects have a place within the corridor. And if you were there for the coronation of Oba Ewai, you find that some of the bronze works were actually kept on the platform where he actually, where the coronation took place. So they are really very vital. They are historical documents. They document court art. They tell a lot about the philosophy of the people. And I think that the only place they belong to is in Nigeria. So this last slide, which is the final slide I'm showing, for me, it tells a lot about how stories are passed on from one generation to the other. The little child behind the woman's back is oblivious of what is going on. But I'm interested here in seeing how the narrative can change. We are tired of this very dark history of 1897. I think we should be looking forward to more illuminating stories that center repair, that center healing, justice, and fairness. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Prof. We'll be taking a few questions now from the audience.
Thank you very much, Prof. You gave out quite a number of, a lot of information. When you started, I was wondering, because Dan Hicks actually had a lot of work, and I was thinking you will struggle. But you're a major force, and what you delivered, responded to quite a number of questions that people like me have about how we will take these things downstream. This is upstream coming from Europe now, and the market is downstream in Nigeria and in Cote d'Ivoire and in Ghana and in Congo. When these works come, I know there are projects, museum projects going on. There's one that was designed by this world-famous architect that is being put together in Benin, and there's one that is, being constructed, I think, somewhere in Senegal or Cote d'Ivoire. But you did make the mention of some of the works that have actually returned, which is. In addition, is director editor-in-chief. Okay, so you took it further by saying it's not just about actually having these works in museum. The ones that have been returned so far, for example, you make, and that's very valid, that actually have gone to the court, of the monarch himself. And some of these works that are returned might actually also end up there. But when you talk about engagement, and I recall some of the things that, the discussion that happened at the Freedom Park a while ago about what we will be doing. What those who are the conscience of the arts, those who generate activity, those who do the programming, their own role, because as it is, the government does not run museums properly here. And so how does this, the economy, the cultural economy, the people who, in quote, run the landscape, how do they get involved in ensuring that those Europeans who think that when these works are actually returned, there won't be a place for them, it will not resonate with the lives of the people here. How do we devise programs? Because you did mention some of those things, but one needs to understand especially from a professor of art like yourself, what your thinking is regarding programming about when these works do, because you can actually also, if when you have a museum, you're still going to display, and the programming ideas are what will determine how much we get value out of these works when they return. Some of your thoughts on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Prof. Great paper. My question is a bit more mundane. I'd like your thoughts on how can the artists in Igun Street, for instance, be encouraged to professionalize their work so much more, so that the same way in European museums you can buy replicas in the gift shops, why can't we have their skills upgraded so that the replicas can also be sold, made and sold in those museums, either in Benin, in other museums, and such that instead of our artists being looked at as artisans, instead of the factories in Switzerland being the ones to replicate our works, why can't our own artists' skills be upgraded so that we can sell replicas, what's the phrase, museum grade replicas of our own work? Thank you.
I think I can let me answer that now and then go to the question that was asked by the first speaker. First of all, I don't like to use the term replicas because when the casters make two works that are very similar, it's not a copy of the other. They are invested separately. They are done not with a mold. They are done separately. And then they are invested and cast separately. So they are original works, even though they look alike. And if you look at the image that Dan Hicks showed of the shrine, pre-1897, you will see that the two ancestral heads there looked very similar. These artists were trained in a particular canon. They were taught what to do. Look at what I do as a master and copy it. You can have your own, you may have your own initiative, but there are particular ways in which the king is depicted. They were idealized images of the king. So if you use the word replica, it's like a copy. You do a replica where you want to imitate a copy and pass it off as an original. That is different from making works that look alike but are original in their own right. Now, in terms of upgrading the technique of casting, we probably know that the technique of casting is known as the repatriation, which is a lost wax technique of casting, which is kind of widespread across many parts of Africa. The casters developed that technique of, casting bronze, but then they were casting shrine objects. They were not very large works. They were not massive works that you find today. The same casters are giving life-size sculptures to cast using the same old recipes of cores and molds, which will not hold. They use laterites for making their cores and the recipes for making the molds. And if you're giving them a commission to do a large-size image, it is not possible to continue to use that material to produce the kind of small-scale sculptures that they were making, in the past. So there's a need. And if you have my book, the catalog, where we have quite a number of scholars contributing, the introduction I wrote, I talked about how we need to invest in those, in the Guild of Casters, not just the Guild of Casters, even the wood carvers as well. Because the art of casting is a very tedious profession. It's very difficult. Working in the foundry drains you. You get dehydrated, you are tired from the smoke and the fire. And these are the craftsmen that have held the tradition going for several centuries. The fame that Benin enjoys today is on account of those craftsmen. They work so hard and they get very little. And because they're using these age-long, worn-out techniques of casting, it's very tedious on them. And that is why you find that a lot of them, their children are also deserting the arts. So there must be a way in which there's some kind of investment to keep them going. For example, I suggested that we could have modern foundries. Yeah, they could still maintain using the Serepedju technique, but we can upgrade the technique so that they can produce more using the same, making the same forms that they are used to, but then upgrading the technique of achieving these cast works that they do. Some of them have tried on their own to have turbines and motorized systems for casting, but I think there is a concerted effort by the Edo State government perhaps, or even private individuals who will invest in this art so that it can continue to serve us the way they've been doing. Because it's a very difficult art, and I think that the casters are doing so much to keep the memory of the culture alive. So back to your question about how do we engage with these works, how do we preserve? I would have wished that Oliver invited somebody from the National Museum or from government to talk about how the structures are on ground. But I know that a lot of people don't have faith in the system that we have, the cultural parastatals, for example. Look at the National Museum, people complain and all of that. I don't want to go into those negative aspects. I think that Nigerians, when they set their minds to do things, they can really do things that are great. But at the same time, it's not to say that even the artworks that are kept in storage in the West are very well kept. We keep having this illusion that these works are really very well preserved. No, but I think that there's a plan to have a museum in Benin, which is an amazing plan. Because when I did the survey in 2003, it was obvious that some of the memorabilia, some of the souvenirs that were coming out and artworks that were coming out of Benin needed a place to be kept for people to see, to visit and see. And it's not just about ancient art, it's also about the contemporary expressions. Artists are still producing and are producing excellent work. So we must have places where we can have show these works and have the younger generation engage with them in ways that are really very meaningful. So we're looking forward to a proper museum built in Benin to show not just the works that are returned, but also the works that emanate from the city and outside of the city as well. Jumoke.
Thank you very much, Prof, for this very insightful presentation and also the feedback that you've given us. But I wanted to ask about the social space, when you think about, the museum. Now there are plans to actually build a museum, which is fantastic. But how do we integrate a social space that also includes all the cultural elements into the planning of the museum? Because I believe that museums are not just about the building in itself, but how people are going to utilize the building. So is there anything happening now, to sort of engage with the people within, different spaces to even find out how they understand or their relationship with the objects and how that would transfer into the final design of the museum?
Well, I can't speak for the architect or the plans that are being made in Benin at the moment. I think it's still being formulated. But I will say that it is important that we do not think about replicating the museums that we find in the West here. It doesn't make any sense to go stand before a glass case and look at an object. I met a young artist from Uganda who looked at, this was in a museum in the US, and she didn't think that she would see the number of Minkisi statues or sculptures. And then when she came and saw about 20 of them, she became hysterical. We're not used to seeing these objects, in those kind of spaces. In fact, when the British came into Benin, to the palace, these objects were piled up in a room. They were in the bedchamber of the king. They were on shrines. Okay, these were not the kind of museums that we find in the West. They were in very sacred spaces. So they don't display those kind of works for people to see. Yeah, so it's a different kind of reading. It's a different kind of appreciation that will come out of works that are returned to Nigeria if they come back. When works move from one geographical space to another, or from one context to the other, they change meaning. I mean, the Benin objects are sacred objects. In the West, they are looked upon as art, without those kind of connections that we talk about. And then they also have imbibe other meanings. They have catalog numbers, the auctioneers put numbers on them, and they become mere commodities. So that commodification is what I pointed out in my project. So I think that is important, and one of the things that I think is also beyond the building itself, and I think the building is key, because elements of Benin history, the way the palace was pre-1897, for example, how the metal bronze was taken down, from the images I saw, are going to be infused in that design, But I don't know if that's going to hold, but I think that it's important that the architecture speaks to how the people live and the kind of spaces that they are also used to, and the function of those spaces within the the city itself. It is very important that we engage the younger generation, like I said earlier on, but it's also because we're a colonized people, there's some kind of loss of self, and self-worth, self-identity with the erasure that has come on account of colonialism. And I think that is a fundamental problem, where we look at everything as fetish. That is also an issue that has to be addressed. So there has to be a rethinking. There has to be a way of getting people, some kind of re-engineering, reorientation, to teach people how to begin to look at, have value in their culture. And I think that the Yemisi Shillong Museum is also thinking about that, bringing younger people into the museum space and showing them objects and not telling them this is juju and running away from it, but appreciating the beauty and the philosophy behind the production of these artifacts. So this is key. It's a very important aspect of it, because I tell you, people will pray and tell you that these are demons, and they will cast out demons from them and all of that, but this is also a hangover from the colonial period.
Yeah, sorry to sound quite pedantic, but honestly, the gentleman there and Ms. Sanwo had a very important point that I don't think has been addressed. Now, we are talking about, if Professor Hicks is to be believed, we have massive amounts of artifacts out there, right? They are being kept in infrastructure. Now, we're talking about infrastructure, we're talking about one museum in Benin, which I think is very inadequate. Now, my question to him, and which I said I'd also put to our academics, and probably our business people as well, economic, and I think she's talking about the socio-economic space here, not about academics. Where are we going to keep them that they're going to be relevant and they're going to be taken as assets? They are assets, they're not just objects to be kept in another room when they're brought here. We know what has happened to repatriated loot, and I think that's what he was talking about. Only yesterday night, I was watching the news, and some people were being asked at National Assembly, you said we shouldn't talk about negative things. We should talk about negative things, because what we want to do is we want to get positivity out of it. So only last night I was listening, and people were being asked, what has happened to this loot, the repatriated funds? Last night, I don't know if anybody else watched Channel News, and nobody seems to know where it is. So if these things come in such volumes, and we do not have plans for where they're going to go, plans in which they're going to put to the proper use, plans in which they're going to be put in proper context, which is what we're talking about, then it's just going to be an exercise in futility. Because okay, let's assume they're all returned. What, are they going to be dumped in one site somewhere? And I'm sure the Benin Museum is not, he listed all the number of museums in which all these artifacts are displayed. There are so many. So what is the private sector? And you also spoke about the youth, and I think the youth, we should also bring in the youth on this, because they have fantastic ideas on how to utilize spaces and how to bring things into particular context like this. So we have to look into where are these things going to be. We have to build capacity to accommodate them, to make them useful, then to also to transfer them into value, which is what has been, which is why I was telling Professor it's been used for business. They've made money out of it. They've made so much social capital out of it. How are we going to do that? We are not just going to bring them and put them in warehouses. There has to be provision for proper infrastructure. He also spoke about manuscripts, for instance, that have to be kept under particular temperatures. You know how humid stuff is here, and deterioration. We can't keep everything on the streets. There's some things that have to be kept under some special conditions. Those things have to be sorted out, and it's not by government. It has to be, let's forget about government for now. It has to be institutions. For instance, we're talking about schools, universities, University of Lagos, university. We can have collaborations with the private sector, and then look for how to build this infrastructure. But we have to get the infrastructure. We have to be ready for them. We're not just going to take them. I agree that they have to be brought back, but not just for bringing back sake. They have to come here to add value to our lives here and bring us back into reality with our past and the present and the future. Thank you very much.
I think he actually answered his own question. Yes, discussions are going on, I think. Okay. Thank you so much.
That you'll agree with me that that was a very brilliant presentation from none other than Princess Beju Laiwola. That's a fun fact because not many of us know that she's actually a member of the Benin royal family. Thank you very much, Professor. Okay, we go to another highlight of this evening, and it's the panel discussion. We've got some brilliant minds who we're going to engage with. Before I do, let me introduce the moderator, Peter Okoto. He's an artist and a curator, and following his professional training at the Kilani Abba Studio, he presently works as a curator at the Center for Contemporary Art, Lagos. His curatorial practice questions pre-existing notions of self and identity while rethinking the ongoing narrative on the decolonization discourse. Okoto's current projects include the digitalization of BC Silva's archive. Please just welcome him to the stage. Peter Okoto, thank you.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. It's interesting to be here and be part of this conversation because I think it's one of the most interesting conversations to have now. And we followed from top to down, from when we had the presentation and the talks by Professor Dan Hicks and Professor Peju. We will just quickly have an introduction of the panelists, then we just quickly go into the conversation. Thank you very much. To go first, we will have the introduction of Mr. Azu Nwambogu. Thank you.
Azu Nwambogu is the founder and director of both the African Artists Foundation and Lagos Photo. In addition, he is director and editor-in-chief of Art-Based Africa. Nwambogu founded the National Art Competition and was a nominator for the Discovery Award at the Rencontre Dale Photography Festival and Contemporary African Photography Award, CAP, in Berlin, where he was a juror. He also juried the World Press Photo, Prisma Photography Award, Greenpeace Photo Award, Dutch Doc, and the PopCap Photography Award. Azu Nwambogu was chief curator at the Zeit Mocha Museum, Cape Town, and before then curated Day Your Lane, Lagos Variations at Boza Center for Fine Arts in Brussels, and Tear My Bra at Rencontre Dale in LA. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Azu Nwambogu to the stage.
Thank you very much, Mr. Azu. You're welcome.
Kofa Adeleke is the president of Legacy, a non-governmental organization that preserves historic buildings and monuments in Nigeria. For almost 30 years, she has engaged in research projects on historic buildings and monuments, organized tours of historic sites, as well as contributed to many papers, publications, public presentations, workshops, and advocacy on such areas as heritage management and public engagement with historic sites. Adeleke is also Director of Programs at Community Conservation and Development Initiative. She holds an MSc Social Policy and Social Administration and a certificate in Sustainable Environmental Management. Ladies and gentlemen, please let's welcome Kofa Adeleke to the stage.
You're welcome, Ms. Kofa Adeleke. Thank you so much. And to complete this panel, we will welcome Dr. Vincent Haribaran. Thank you.
Dr. Vincent Haribaran is the director of IFRA, the French Institute for Research in Africa, Institute of African Studies, University of Ibadan, Nigeria, while being on leave from King's College London. He has published 2 books on the history of Nigeria, including A History of Borno, published by Hearst and Oxford University Press in 2017. Heribaron also has a strong interest in environmental history and digital humanities. Trained as a history and geography teacher, he has taught in France, China, Guinea, and England. Heribaron holds a PhD on the history of Borno, Nigeria from the University of Leeds and was a Lever Holme teaching fellow at the same institution. In addition, he was a visiting lecturer at the University of California, Los Angeles, and presently teaches in the History Department at King's College London. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Vincent Heribaron. Thank you.
Dr. Vixen, you're welcome. Thank you so much. All right. We'll take the panel discussion this way. We'll have a moderated panel discussion, and then after which we would have open up to question and answers. I would like to start off the questions from where we were almost having an argument here when he asked the question, and Professor Beju gave a very interesting closing to it. And the first question we go to Mrs. Kofo, because we're talking about how these artifacts will be managed, how will they come, and you have background in that. So I'll just say the first question: the creation of museums to house the return collections and the capacity building of culture professionals is important. How can they be made more relevant to the debate in terms of new technologies, improved access, and fostering and circulating the cultural property? I mean, we want to have a new museum. How will this affect?
Well, first of all, I think that this really is now about taking back control. You know, the years and years and years of work that's been done to try to bring back the Benin bronzes, it actually looks now that it's really happening. And that was to take back control, to take those artifacts, those sacred objects back. But now we have to start taking control of the way we manage our museums. That's the work that really needs to be done. Now, one of the things, you know, to give a little bit perspective on museums, it's rather ironic that in Europe and America now, they are desperately trying to rethink the way they are managing their museums. Now, in Nigeria, we inherited a colonial model. And so it would be interesting now that we haven't really started to sit down to think about how we need to change things, because we have about, 50 government-run museums in Nigeria, and they're not working. They haven't worked for a long time. That model hasn't worked. Okay. Now, the museums in Europe and America, they've started to plan and think about how to change things. I mean, the Black Lives Matter movement and all lots of different things, including the Benin dialogue, have actually prompted all of this. But I don't think we've actually started to have that discussion here at all. And it would be quite ironic if we now, after being saddled with an old model which was actually sort of imposed on us, whether now, in desperation, we now start looking and saying, oh, this is what they're doing in Europe, and we start copying again. Yeah. So it's so important now that we have to come up with our own ideas and our own plans. Now, I think the new museum that's going to be built in Benin, there's been a lot of discussion about that, but we don't really know exactly what it's going to look like. We don't really know the ideas behind how it's going to be designed and what it's going to do. So one of the museums which is actually up and running is the Yemisi Shillong Museum, Pan-Africa Center, and they're doing things differently in terms of the way they're engaging with students and all those kind of programs and the way they're trying to interpret it, and also working in a university environment. Yeah. And so that is one thing that is actually happening here. But these things do cost a lot of money, and it needs a lot of investment. Now, there's also some people are saying, oh, well, when it comes to restitution, reparations, and things like that, maybe we should also, apart from asking for the artifacts back, maybe we should also ask for money to do what we need to do. But there are also some dangers in that as well, because I think that we do have people in this country who do actually have a lot of money, and so we should actually now be reaching out to them to sort of try and fund the kind of things that we want to do. But the thing is, before we do that, we really, the people in the heritage industry, the heritage sector, need to have some very clear aims and objectives, even before you start looking for the investment. And from what I can see, we have not really sat down to have those real discussions. Now, when people were talking about museums, and as people have already said, a museum doesn't necessarily have to be a building. And one of the things that I sort of advocated many years ago, I said that every local government in Nigeria should have a museum. It doesn't necessarily have to be a physical museum. It could just be a museum space where certain activities and things that could go on. Now, that is one thing. Another thing, this return of the Benin bronzes has to really go with a lot of research, because Dan Hicks' book and also some of these other books that have been coming out, I've been reading them, and there are gaps. There are so many gaps, and so there has to be research. So when we're looking at how the museum should be organized, we have to get the universities involved to work with these museums, because we have all these museums that are languishing. Apart from having partnerships with private individuals, they can also join hands with universities so that we can start to do the research. I mean, there's a whole, I could go on and on. There's a whole catalogue of things that need to be put in place. And I haven't really seen any group really coming together to do that. I mean, the Benin Dialogue, they had their own objectives, which was actually to bring the objects back. But I think we need to start a new dialogue where we actually put together the kind of individuals who have, the thinking, the right kind of thinking, the ideas to do this. And we're talking about the other people who could be involved. I mean, I think for many, many years, artists have done a wonderful job in terms of highlighting our pre-colonial history, because our pre-colonial history has actually really been taken away from us. And that is something that we need to take back. And by bringing these objects back, that is also a way that we can start now learning about our pre-colonial history.
Thank you very much. Absolutely. Thank you so much. Dr. Vincent, the British Museum and the National Institute in the United Kingdom are preventing formally the return of this artifact by the British Museum Act 1963 and the Heritage Act 1983. Private, regional and local museums face not the same restrictions. The British Museum is now considering lending an unspecific number of artifacts to Nigeria, with the clause that the objects will be returned. What do you think informs this adamant approach to a glaring case of pillage, and how do you think this will be addressed?
Well, it's a difficult question, I guess, to answer right now, straight away. But I would say first, there's a large part of the European population, not just the British one, which still is very proud of the colonial past. And that's something which sounds incredible to say here in this room, but there was a poll last year in Britain, at the beginning of last year, just before the COVID crisis, and nearly a third of the respondents said they were extremely proud of the British colonial past. And that's something which is, well worth taking into account when we try to think about politics in Europe, in each European country. Last week, a newspaper in Portugal talked about the good times of the colonies. I could say the same thing about France, to be honest. Same thing happens in each country. The Spanish are very proud of colonial past, so in America. So this is very important to understand that basically there's still, I guess, a large part of the European countries who are very proud of their colonial past, and that's, obviously, that's not my personal opinion, but that needs to be taken into account when we talk about this. It means as well that this question of restitution is extremely divisive in all these European countries, meaning that if you've got, say, a third of the population, which is proud of the past, you're going to have, a small proportion of people who are going to be adamantly against it, against them as well. So all European countries actually are extremely divided about this question, the question of the colonial past, colonial legacy, about teaching in general the colonial past, the atrocities of the transatlantic slave trade, the atrocities of the colonial period. And I guess here there's it's a fight which is done, in each country, which is done in each university as well. Like what you said about universities, that's something we try to do, about education in general. Education is important, I guess. That will be my last point to answer your question, because I guess there's a whole ignorance as well about this looting which took place in Benin, which took place in many parts of the former colonial world. I mentioned America in the case of Spain and Portugal, but I could also talk about China, I can talk about India, I could talk about Africa in general. Most Europeans don't know anything at all about what happened actually in this period. So if they go to museums, which happens less and less, and I sound very pessimistic, I know, but if they go to museum, they won't even know what they're seeing, basically. And that's a real problem of education, I guess, in all European countries. I don't want to point fingers on one country in particular here. There's clearly one thing which is about ignorance. As you might have heard, I was teaching in a British university, and I always talk about this issue to my own students. And the fact is that many of them I've never heard about this looting at all, And this could be said about the looting of Benin City. This could be said about looting of Abomi in the Republic of Benin, about Kumasi in Ghana. We know all the cases of colonial looting. So I guess ignorance as well is one of the problems which I guess explain, not justify, but just explain this adamant, if I want to use your word, policy here. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. Ms. Azu, many African countries have seen their cultural properties seized and scattered across the globe. Loss of this heritage have left deep wounds and represented a potential loss in the historical memories for the future generation. Kindly enlighten us about the colonial destruction that has happened, the impact of it in Nigeria. Because we all can say that somehow all over the world there's a part of Africa everywhere, and we, the younger generation, actually have seen. Can you just enlighten us to let us know how these have affected how we can manage the conversation going on?
When we talk of restitution, it's really a case of cultural imperialism.
True.
Right. So the recent agitation around restitution, which is a very complicated word, was catalyzed and accelerated by the report commissioned by President Macron. And it was commissioned by Felwinser and Benedict Savoy. And I don't know how many people have actually studied the report, because it is important to understand the foundation of the current conversation. And if you unpack the report, we understand that there is, as you rightly pointed out, an interruption in heritage and learning, and that obfuscation of history and the denial of a certain intelligence that Africans have through this looting needs a sort of translocation. And Professor Achille Mbembe talks about a new relational aesthetics.
True.
That is to say, we need not look back too much at the overly romanticize the colonial interruption, or look back too much about this whole conversation about Benin bronzes. For me, it's almost distracting from the core work that needs to be done. Of course, I do want the objects to be returned, but there is a broader conversation that is much deeper and much more interesting and more intelligent, and an intelligence that is also codified in a lot of these objects that were looted. And so the idea that we keep talking about the bronzes is almost for me like a kind of a red herring. They return the bronzes, but we need a return of a reversal of cultural imperialism. So you do not do that by returning a bunch of objects. Felwinser also talks about distribution, while Achille Mbembe talks about a new relational aesthetics. The Savoy report talks about a redistribution. a way of circulating these objects, because a lot of these objects were taken from cultures that were older than the so-called European or Western civilization, and they were taken from cultures that were formulated before nations. So we need to start thinking a bit more about how do we begin to find that intelligence that is codified in these objects. And by that I mean there are, February 2010, before the lockdown, I traveled and I banked on a trip with a bunch of researchers from my team at the African Artists Foundation and Professor Clementine Dillis, and we traveled visiting a lot of the museums, municipal museums in Nigeria, and we do have a lot of these objects still in the museums. So the idea is, this sort of interminable waiting, or this sort of my idea of this logic where we're sort of hoping that we get the bronzes and then everything changes, is quite, untrue. We need to really face up to the responsibility of thinking about a new relational aesthetics. I love the work of Professor Elaiwola, the idea that she expounds. We just need that times 100, times 500. We just need a lot more contemporary artists doing what contemporary artists can do. We need more contemporary art spaces, and we need to be thinking about museums as performing a very important function in this country or in Africa, where our universities, whether we own up to the fact or not, are failing. And we need a museum, we need museums to provide that civic space where someone without a HND or GCSE or OA levels or whatever can walk into a museum and get an education about your history and your heritage and your culture, and also just how to be a part of society. And so these are the functions of a museum, and I'd employ and join everyone here to begin to think of a museum completely from a different perspective, not what you've learned or what you've seen. And as you rightly point out, it's these current museums that we all celebrate are struggling to find a new relevance, right? I know because I'm in constant conversation with a whole bunch of them, and they are struggling to be nimble, to be able to react faster to the rapidly changing demographics of society. So if we're thinking about a museum for the 21st century in Africa, then we have a real opportunity to be, should I say, innovators, or to set the example, not just for us, but for the majority world people, not just Africans. There are other nationalities, other cultures that have suffered the same humiliation and destruction. So those are my ideas.
Okay, I will just take a question. I would just give the next question to Mrs. Kofo. This issue of we don't have space to manage these artifacts when they are being returned is a major, and it's been overflogged really. Let's not forget that these things were not in some kind of museums when they were looted. They were in. Is that enough reason for them not to be, for this artifact not to be returned? Is that enough reason for them not to be returned?
Yeah, I think, you see, the issue now is that a lot of time has actually passed, and it's true that a lot of these objects, they are not there for art. They were religious objects. They were kept in maybe not. I mean, I'm not just talking about the Benin bronzes now. Sort of other things as well. They were, in shrines, in palaces, and they were used for religious purposes and things like that. So that's why we really do have to sort of have this conversation about, okay, these things are coming back. Do we have the spaces for them? Where are we going to put them, and what's going to happen? We haven't had that conversation, and that is one of the major problems. But I do think that what you said earlier was in that we now have to sort of realize that, you know, it's more than just the actual objects, and so returning them shouldn't really be sort of the be all and end all. I would say that yes, it's definitely not going to be mission accomplished. It's sort of mission started, but I do think that they are important because that can actually trigger something. It can trigger what you have actually been saying you want to happen. Yeah. And so that is where we can start to say, okay, how are we going to use these things? Where are we going to put them? What they're for? Now, I would just also, before I forget, to say that when you were saying that in some of the universities where you were teaching in Europe, they didn't know anything about what happened in 1897. I'm quite sure that there are so many people in Nigeria who also don't know about 1897. And so these are the things. So hopefully all of this is going to, rather than, you know, us worrying so much about, where are we going to house these things, where are we going to put them, and where are we going to do this, and where are we going to do that, we should be putting more emphasis on the fact that, okay, yes, they're coming back. What do they mean for us? How are we going to use them, or the fact that they are, you know, people are talking about them, to reclaim our pre-colonial history, which really has been really lost. A few years ago, I remember I was in a seminar, a conference. It was to do with traditional religion. And somebody said that Islam and Christianity are two very recent visitors to Nigeria. People are so afraid about talking about our traditional religion. And it is through our traditional religions that we can start to learn about our pre-colonial history. And also, the return of these objects, the discussion around the return of these objects is also very important because of people. We shouldn't just think of ourselves here in Nigeria. We should also think about Africans in the diaspora, people who were taken away by force. They're not interested in colonial history. Anytime you talk to them, they want to know about our pre-colonial history. And this is the point where we can actually really start to do some investigations. We need anthropologists, we need archaeologists. We need a whole array of different disciplines. I think somebody else was saying that, it's the people in Europe who are doing all the writing and all the academic stuff. True. We need to start doing this here. I know that we have a lot of Nigerians who are in America doing all of this research, but it really upsets me that more of this work is not being done here on the ground, where we can do proper investigations. Because when I was reading about all the history about what happened in 1897, some of the villages were being mentioned. I think that's, are these villages still there? Have they gone? Have they been erased? What's happened? All of the routes, the transport routes that were around at that time, and these were things that go back a long time. We need more of that kind of investigation to go on. So yes, the return of these objects, it's symbolic, it's very, very important, but I don't really think that we should be banging ourselves on the heads too much about where they're going to go and how we're going to look after it, although that is important. And we do need a whole range of new skills to do these things. And one other thing I just want to say now is that if a child goes to his or her parent and says, I want to study museum studies, or I want to do archaeology at university, or anthropology, what the response is going to be.
Definitely.
And we need these people desperately. And so this is why we're now talking about all of this, and these are the things we need to address. These are the things that are going to help us as a nation.
All right. Thank you very much. The next question goes to Dr. Vincent. Arguably, the French government made the first significant move towards the repatriation of looted objects to Africa. What has that development been? What's the development since then? What has happened after that time?
Clearly, we heard recently that Germany has taken the lead in this whole process, but this has translated in France into a law which was promulgated at the end of December last year. It's quite a recent one, for the restitution of 27 objects. One to the Republic of Senegal, it was a saber of El Hadj Matar, who resisted against the French, and 26 objects to the Republic of Benin, taken from the Kingdom of Abomey. It was called the treasury of Behanzin, the king, who resisted against the French. So here we're talking about 27 objects. It's not a lot, one would argue, but this shows you actually how the French legal system works, which means that you've got an ad hoc law being voted in Parliament, and you've got a full legal process. I mean, it takes quite a few years, you can tell, to be adopted, and for something which might seem quite a meager result. Still, there's been a change of attitude among French politicians. We mentioned the Savoy and Saar report just before, and if you want to read it, it's available in English, freely online. You can judge by yourself. Politicians have decided themselves to take the matter into their own hands and try to make it a more political subject. So as you can tell, it's part of a cultural diplomacy. Clearly here, we're talking about diplomacy. But as well, it's part of a project from President Macron to discuss this with this philosopher from Cameroon, Achille Mbembe, you mentioned him before as well, to make it a public subject for people to discuss and to consider before, a French summit, which is going to take place in Montpellier, a southern French town, in September. It's the Africa-France Summit of September this year. As you can tell here, the question is heavily politicized. I can't shy away from this fact here. But still, this raises awareness, I suppose. And here, this goes against my argument before, which was a bit pessimistic about the ignorance, which was quite widespread in European societies. I guess the whole point is to make people aware of the whole situation. And as a lecturer, as an academic myself, I'm very happy of this, because people more and more ask questions about this. Maybe 10 years ago, people have asked where Benin was. They would have thought it was the Republic of Benin. Maybe today they know that actually it was a kingdom with a very long history, which can be conflated into one date, 1887, so 7 centuries of history before being invaded by the Europeans, and that that's something which is very important here as well to remember. So I guess awareness, is something which is there. Is it something tangible? Not yet, but I hope for the future, yes. That's what I would say.
Thank you so much. To speak to that, I remember that, and to actually corroborate with what Mr. Kufu said, I remember we worked on a project last year, Kelani Abbas's exhibition at the National Museum on re-entanglement, and what we discovered was just alarming, because there's this anthropologist who came to Nigeria. I can't remember the date now. He's not called Thomas, and he took photographs. He did a lot of expansive work that you can't imagine that those materials were docked sometimes in the British Council in the office there until they were sent to the National Museum, and the National Museum never knew what it was until Professor Basu came to Nigeria for that project, but from Benin, and then we were privileged to see those pictures, those research he did, and it was for me a whole lot of nostalgia, because I was wondering that these things are here and nobody really know about them. And I can tell, again, to knowledge is because we need anthropologists, is that the National Museum here has a whole lot in their holding. I can attest to that, because I was there for some months, and I can tell you that I was privileged to enter some places, and I was wondering, these things are here and we don't even know about them, and nobody knows. I don't know if everybody, I don't feel that it is just kept somewhere and some people don't really care about them. So I think we need a level of education for us to get to know all these things. Thank you very much. The next question to Mr. Azu. This, the artifacts are a puzzle of our history, right? They are part of our history, because I can imagine that Ms. Kofo, you talk about Nigeria, you talk about legacies, and sometimes don't you wonder that it's like there's something missing if you want to really refer people sometimes? Don't you think there's something missing? I'll come back to that, but I want to put this question to Mr. Azu, that the Benin objects are part of the missing puzzle of our history, being alienated from their ecology, reduce the significance. How can this be explained, and how can this make sense in the sense of repatriation? Because these artifacts have been taken away from their original place to another place, and it has lost its significance. What will the repatriation be? What will it do if you bring them back?
Again, the sort of relic diplomacy and the sort of, I'll be honest and say that, of course, I'm interested, and I've actually been in Berlin in touch with the German Foreign Office, actively discussing conversations around the return. So it's not that I repudiate or I'm bored of it, but the sort of relic diplomacy truly does not concern me too much. As a curator and the director of a foundation, and I am more interested in the ecology and the interruption and the learning that we can find through these objects. As I say, when we went out to the various museums in Nigeria, there were toys that were designed and made from the 18th century. These were, and when you sort of keep talking about these sort of shiny objects, we deny the collective humanity of a people. And so when you talk about toys that were designed, that were made with such intelligence, you know, you put a ball, a little stone in the mouth, and the stone drops and the armpit comes out in the stomach. These were instruments for social cohesion, for education. So there's a whole bunch of objects that were made, fish traps that were designed such that you could fish ecologically and, you know, sustainably. There is so much low tech and so much high tech and codified information in a lot of these objects. But the problem is that we're obsessed with this whole conversation around Benin bronzes, which is really important and can be a great spark, and can be a great ignition for the wider conversation we need to be having around reversing, as I say, this cultural imperialism. But I think the most important thing we should be talking about now is how do we build the architecture for the future museology for Africa? And I'm talking about the intellectual architecture, not just the physical spaces. We're talking about, oh, we need to build a space here, we need to find a space there. We should be talking about how do we support the learning that makes it possible so that we can understand and appreciate and also begin to quickly unlearn the sort of colonial fog that has made a lot of us really confused about our heritage, about our identity, about our history, and again, the idea of waiting for someone to do the right thing is absurd, right? Yeah. I mean, it's almost like you're giving power to someone else. And if you look all over Twitter and social media, it's the Germans patting themselves on the back, celebrating. I mean, they take from you, they clap for themselves, they return the clap for themselves. How ridiculous is that? So it's the idea that we are sort of victims waiting is sort of taking away responsibility from what we can be doing. And last year, when with Lagos Photo, we themed the festival Rapid Response Restitution. The idea was to find a way to spark a citizen's interest in the idea of restitution, or to spark a citizen interest in looking at any object as museum-worthy and beginning to understand the role that objects play in objects of virtue play in sort of communicating an idea of space, cosmology, history, heritage. And those are the things that really excite me, and I'm hoping that through the gesture of the return, that we can really begin to have these proper conversations about building a better society, if you like.
All right, thank you very much, sir. I'll take this question to Mrs. Kofo, because I think that the question still comes almost back to your discipline. The debate around the restitution of cultural property is multifaceted and goes beyond the legal frameworks. How would you highlight the role of the UNESCO intergovernment community to promoting the return of cultural properties for the to the countries of origin, or its restitute in the case of illicit appropriation? And what conversation need to be held at regional and international level to contribute to the ongoing debate and to the development of new international relations?
Yeah, for years, there have been lots of conversations, going around about, these organizations, they do have a role. These are organizations that actually work with governments and in terms of the legal frameworks and, all of those kind of things. I think it's very, very important, and it has to continue, it has to go on. But I still feel that for us here in Nigeria right now, we need to focus much more on what we want out of this in terms of reclaiming our pre-colonial history. That's of much greater concern to me than all of the legal arguments that will be going to and fro, although I'm not saying that they are not important. But one thing, to go back to when you were sort of asking the question about, where do we put all these things and what are we going to do with them? There is another argument which is it could be a bit disingenuous, because of course there are some museums in Europe and America that obviously want to hang on to these things, but there is the argument that there are a lot of Africans, in the African sort of diaspora, and so therefore, there's no reason to say that, some of them should not be spread around the world. Although there are other problems with the interpretation of some of these things, because I remember reading somewhere that, the way we're talking about the Benin collection now, although there are sort of others, the way it was scattered all over the place was really awful. There was a case of, there was one museum, some of them were sort of done on sort of like plates, and so there was one figure that there was one plate that had an arm, and then one sort of had the head and another part of the body, and then one plate is in a museum in Germany, and another one I think is in a museum in America. That kind of craziness. So that is really a huge problem which needs to be looked at in terms of how these collections can be brought together, and that does need sort of international cooperation, which is something that maybe organizations like UNESCO and at different levels can facilitate. But going back to the importance of pre-colonial history, in museums in Europe, they have a subject called classics, where they're studying the Greek, the Roman, the Egyptian gods. And even today, people are still doing deep, deep research, and they hold it in so much high regard. We have our own gods, but we need to start elevating that to the same level. It is African classical history, and that is what people never really talk about. So these are the areas where we need to start focusing attention.
Just to actually speak to that, is there a reason why we don't talk about these things? Is there a major reason why we don't talk about
I think some people have already touched upon it. It's this idea, it's this fear. We've been made to be afraid of ourselves and afraid of our history and our culture. We've been told that with traditional religion, we have really thrown the baby out with the bathwater. A couple of years ago, I went to Cuba, and they have a museum on Yoruba heritage. And I just thought to myself, wow, in Cuba, they have a museum on Yoruba heritage. So far, we haven't got one here. There are certain things about traditional, people all over the Americas now, they are very, very much interested in Yoruba traditional religion. But if people want to study it, where do they go? They go to places like Cuba to study it. So these are the things that we need to ask these questions. Why have we sort of distanced ourselves from these things?
Thank you very much. Dr. Vincent, the argument exists that the refusal to return the pillaged artifact to Africa, for example, they are being held to help the world keep or protect their culture, which is one of the arguments they have, in order to share it with the world. How true is this, considering that only 1% of the Benin looted artifact, for example, is being displayed and others are hidden away?
That's a tough question. Let me start with the example I was just saying. I was teaching in London until quite recently, and actually I take regularly my students to the British Museum to see the Benin plaques. They are in the basement of the British Museum in the Sainsbury's Gallery, and you can take them to basically to show them what was done with the art itself, everything we discussed today, the artifacts, what they meant in their context, what they mean, the different meaning they have in the museum, and I'll talk about the looting and the absence, or near absence of a description of the looting in the museum. They talk about it, but very quickly. And then if you tour the museum, you can see different things looted in different parts of the world, and this happens in every European capital, so not just London, really. So I guess in this case only, I guess I could say this is not justified, but this is how it can be used by people in Europe. The fact that so many of these artifacts are held in storerooms in European museums, in the large ones, I mean here, is definitely one of the problems. Professor Hicks mentioned before there's something like 800 of them in the storerooms, in the storage of the British Museum. The same thing could be said about the Louvre in Paris or some other museums in the rest of the world, without doubt. The problem is that here is that we're just talking about big museums here. And small museums as well, as Professor Hicks mentioned before, also have some of them, and that's one of the main problems as well here. They think they're showing the culture of the rest of the world to the people, and that's if they lose it, they will lose everything, which is that they will lose their raison d'être, I might say. Obviously here, this argument might seem disingenuous. That's another one here, clearly, because there's so many things to be shown, and we can talk about contemporary art, which is maybe much more interesting, which is meant to circulate around the world. Whereas here we're talking about different things. We're talking about artifacts which were stolen, and this can be proven very quickly. As a historian, I can tell you I like evidence, I like facts, and sometimes people tend to have vague descriptions of what's being held in museums. We've got the storerooms, we've got a mass of things, we don't know what they are. Let's keep them in the dark, let's not talk about them. But actually, yes, we can, in the case of the Benin plaques, for example, say, look, this was acquired from this person who acquired from that person, and you can retrace the whole genealogy, the whole chain of owners, of previous owners, and you can go back to original looting, basically. And so if you can establish proof, evidence, basically, that's enough. And I think that's what needs to be done, basically, here. Work, in Europe on every single artifact, which needs to prove actually that things were stolen, or to prove actually how they were acquired. And if this can be proven they were acquired, after when a colonial act of looting, and it happened a lot, again, throughout the world, well, that's a good case for restitution, I might say. Yeah.
You also know that there's an argument that says, there's for Africans to get them back, especially Nigerians to get their artifacts back. I said we wait for maybe when they are doing auctions, then we go buy them back for us to have them. Or there's another one that says that it's too late because we've allowed it go too long. But do you agree that it's too long for us to have to be having this conversation now? Because this is almost more than 120 years now, and somebody's saying that it's too late, that we're making the wrong move at the wrong time, and that's why we're getting the roadblocks we keep getting when these conversations come up.
Well, in Nigeria, there's been calls for restitution for some of the stolen artifacts since the 1930s, since we saw the restitution of the regalia of the Oba of Benin in the 1930s. In the 1970s, there was the Festac, and we saw the whole thing about Queen Lydia's mask. One of them is in New York, one of them is in London, and I'm sure there's others, around the world. So actually, it's not totally new here. Believing that the debate is new actually is not helpful. I think here. I think it's an old debate, and it's got renewed with different ways of seeing it. But I don't think it's that new. I think that's why the history of the debates is also important here. And if you talk to countries such as India as well, they've been asking for the return of stolen artifacts since the end of the 19th century, in India. And Britain still holds, for example, gigantic diamond, which is part of the crown jewels. You can see in the Tower of London. So that's an example like that. So I guess writing the history of this looting is necessary here. Yes, definitely.
Okay, thank you very much. Do we have any other thing we want to speak to before we open up to Q&A here on the panel? Do you have anything you want to speak to?
Yeah, there was one point that I just wanted to make in terms of how, you know, we can. It's just a trigger. It's a spark for us to learn so much. I didn't really know too much, because I think this is also something that is going to happen with the new museum in Benin that's going to be built there. I think there's also a project to try and excavate the moat that was originally sort of around the palace or the whole kingdom. Yeah. And, you know, there's a lot of interesting information that is coming out of that, because, I mean, I didn't know that earthwork was actually longer originally. I mean, of course, a lot of it has been lost now, but originally it was actually longer than the Great Wall of China. True. And also that the amount of excavation that came out of it is actually more work was put into it than the pyramids. And I think some people might have heard of Sungbo's Eredo, which is here in Lagos around Ekpe. And I think there was some research done on that a long time ago. I don't know whether research is still being done on it, but that place has also been linked to Benin. So these are the sort of things that are now coming out where we can actually start learning more. So it's the return of these objects is very important, but it should really spark so many other things. And also we shouldn't also forget, we talk about the 1897 expedition. There were lots of expeditions that were going all over Nigeria. In Ilorin, Ibadan, all these places, and there was looting and destruction going on in those places, but we don't really talk about those ones. And I think, you know, this should encourage us to talk about lots of other things. And I mean, history being taught in schools today is also a fundamental issue. It is really the root of a lot of it. That really needs to have a root and branch review, right from primary to university level.
Thank you very much. Quickly, before we just open the floor to questions and the microphones begin to go around, I can see several hands up there. Okay, the first person in front.
Thank you very much. Here. Just like the last speaker spoke, I'm just looking at it and thinking about the offshoot, how it affects society at large. And conversations like this are very important, but for me personally, I'm speaking for myself, but how they are curated are also very particular. Like, I can do without Mr. Vincent in this particular conversation, right? And maybe another woman on the panel would have actually expanded the conversation, Nigerian. The idea of restitution and our capacity as a country and continent can be fully addressed without going back to those giving agency, funds, and position globally. For instance, Alliance Française, since inception, always send white directors. You know, that's also a form of position. And that person would always do the bidding of France. So these are very important conversations that we should be having. Yes, the bronzes will come back. I think the Oba and the people the Oba select, whether he decides to work with the state government and the federal government, the Oba, these objects are owned, you know, because nobody ever says it. These objects are owned by the Oba, right? And it should go back to that. But on a global state, I think positions of power, because people always say, oh, we do not have funding. There are people giving funding. There are PhD holders. There's white people who become professors who study are funded. So there are people here who would like to become researchers, to become curators, and they need funding. And institutions like this are always led by white people, and they'll do their bidding. So these are conversations to look at.
Okay, let's have another question.
So my question is really just to echo a lot of the things that were said by Kofo. So thank you for all the contributions that everybody made. But I'd like to focus on sustainability. A big part of this conversation really is the maintenance culture. So how are we going to fund the maintenance culture of our culture? How are we going to institutionalize gift giving, donors, and just really push philanthropy? I mean, venture philanthropy or philanthropy in general is very new to Nigeria. And I think if we're going to maintain our cultures physically or spiritually or emotionally, we have to actually institutionalize gift giving. And that's a very big hole that needs to be filled. And I just wonder, where are those conversations happening? We've spoken about restitution for too long, and from a kind of emotional, symbolic sense. But in terms of like, how are we actually going to fund these museums? How are we going to keep that happening for centuries? I think those conversations need to be held publicly. So I wonder where that's happening, and if that's something that will, sprout from this.
Okay, I think Ms. Kofo, if you can speak to that.
Yeah, I think, right now, I don't really think that the conversation has really started in the way it should start. We have people in universities, we have the National Commission for Monuments, we have artists, we have a whole range of people, and we have cultural centres like this one. We have a whole array of people, but then we have to come some kind of. I think that there's strength in numbers. That's for sure. There's strength in numbers. For example, the Benin dialogue has been, over a long period, has been successful. But that was, there was a lot of energy in that from Europe. But I think that this conversation that we need to have now needs to be really within Nigeria. It has to be amongst Nigerians. How we identify the right kind of people who should really come together to, form that kind of very strong coalition, how it will be funded. These are the issues. We are always talking about, there is funding from abroad and various places, true. But the thing is, there is a lot of money in Nigeria. There is money in Nigeria. And it will take a lot of hard work. But we need to sort of get some people together who really have good minds, how we can put together very, very good proposals to actually say to people in Nigeria, look, we need to spend money on this. And we need to have a plan. So I don't think that is happening at the moment at all. And this really should be a trigger for it to happen. It is an opportunity. We've had lots of opportunities in Nigeria before. We had oil. That was an opportunity. The oil economy has gone. That's past. We've lost that. Other oil economies are now moving on to other things. So we lost that opportunity. Climate change also was another opportunity for Nigeria to turn itself around. Because I've worked on that area for a long time as well. But unfortunately, I still feel that we are going to miss that opportunity, climate change, to actually turn things around. This is another opportunity where we could actually really come together and form, a very strong coalition. As I said, strength in numbers. And, get Nigerians. I'm not saying we shouldn't look for outside funding as well, but really and truly, because I think that if we start spending our own money on it, then we might actually start, valuing what we are trying to do more. Although I know that there is an argument that, there are other issues as why we should be getting funding from abroad and things like that, and I'm not ruling that out. But those are some of the things, some of the ideas that I have.
Thank you very much. Just to help us manage time, we only will take 2 more questions. I can see Jessica's hands up. Let's give the microphone to him.
I'm very pleased to hear what Azu said about broadening the conversation. And also very happy to hear what Kofo has to say about looking at pre-colonial societies. I just wanted to give you a little sample of something that we are trying to do at our museum. Tomorrow, Wednesday, 26th of May, we start a program that is going to focus on Benin. It's for secondary school children from public schools in the Ibejuleki areas. We start with 20 kids tomorrow. We thought, we have 16 Benin bronzes in our museum. We thought, what are we going to do with these bronzes? What are they good for? We are tired of just a visitor who comes and says, wonderful, beautiful, takes a selfie, a photograph, goes. This is irrelevant. So we thought, can we organize a program that has an impact on people using these Benin bronzes? So we organize a broader program that is called Pre-Colonial Societies of Nigeria. The pilot program is on Benin. We start tomorrow. We work with 5 Cowridge initiative. We have created a program that will be, the kids will spend the whole day there learning not about Benin art, not only about Benin bronzes, but about Benin culture, history, tradition, religion, as you mentioned, organization, the society, the position of women, everything, or everything we can do in this limited time. I think this is a tiny, it's nothing. It's 20 kids one day. We hope to continue. But we need more initiatives like this, I think, from different angles, from different positions, from different, I don't know, I think I had the feeling that we are following a Western narrative here. The story is framed in the West. For myself, as a director of a museum in Nigeria, the problem is not the restitution. If I were the director of the British Museum or the museum in Vienna or Berlin or somewhere, that would be my problem, that I have works that are looted, and what do I do with them? But this is not our problem. Of course, we need these works because it's a matter of justice that were stolen to be back. But our problem is, what do we do with these works that we have? What do I do with the 16 Benin bronzes that I have in our museum? How can they have an impact? How can they serve? How can people discover things? How can people learn? I think this is a conversation, and I'm glad to hear this. It's a conversation that we have to have here, among us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jessica. That's a very good move. We'll take one more question and then. Okay, there's one hand up. Thank you.
I'm really thankful for all the points of views that have been expressed here. My name's Sadiq Ajibola Williams. I'm an artist, but I'm also, I think I'll throw this question at Azu, because I know the work you've been doing over the years at AAF, and my question would be how? I understand most of the conversation pieces that are going on and the importance of them, but how and when do African or Black elites start supporting? Because it's one thing for us to talk about what's gone on in the past and all these support systems, but I think most of us in here are very aware that from a sort of financial or an investment perspective, we're not really doing enough. There are multiple points of views, but I also feel like the onus is really, at this point in our history, on us to actually start taking our art seriously. So I would like to find out like how, when, or what are the moves that are being made, because it's still an ongoing question amongst many artists. For example, we don't have that many philanthropists or backers or supporters. They're few and far in between, and it's 2021. Is that conversation really, really being spurred on? All the other things that are going on are a bit weird to me. The other angle I'm also concerned about is history has said over and over and over what has occurred. So I don't understand why we are still debating what already is. It's been recorded, it's been spoken about. I don't personally see the legalities or any of the legal issues, why there should be any need for it. We have the space, we have the people, we have the structures, we have the wherewithal. So it's a bit jarring, to be quite honest. I think we're being a bit too polite on that front. But on the home front, I'm still always going to talk about the onus being on our people, our elders, our system, our structures. I don't think we're doing enough, and I support what Professor Castellete is saying also. I think that conversation really needs to start happening. We're seeing that conversation in other creative spaces, but in the core space that's really important, art, artifacts, history, culture, I don't think it's happening enough. Like, how and what can we do to really push this further?
Thank you, Sadiq, for that response. I'd also like to just make a point clear that I have these conversations about restitution, cultural returns, repatriation. When I'm outside in Berlin or in France, I'm not speaking the way I'm speaking in this room, just to be clear. And when I'm speaking to people in this room, just to be clear, I'm a little hard and direct because Oliver Ewong, for example, has been regularly organizing these talks. He has his magazine. There are art institutions, organizations in Lagos here. There is the Center for Benin Culture and Heritage in Benin. I've been there. There are great cultural institutions and interesting spaces doing incredible work here that do not get the kind of support that they deserve. We are interested in celebrations and festivals and the selfies, but we need to be supporting the hard slog, the hard work that is going on regardless. Ni Kwate Owo made an incredible film in 1970 called You Hide Me. I don't know how many people here have seen it, but there's nothing new to add to the debate around restitution if you've seen that film. It's not free. If you want to watch it, pay 500 naira or something like that. And then you get maybe 1,000 naira and then you get access to it. But pay, he made the film. Support the artist. I think there is the idea that we're constantly waiting, and this is my sort of irritation with the conversation around we're waiting for the Germans to do the right thing, or the French, or the Brits. We need to do more with the resources at hand. We need to support the institutions that are here, because someone here mentioned, the French have a white person. It's the French Cultural Center. That's their mission, to promote their own culture in other countries. So, we need to be getting mad at the right people, not the French Cultural Center. So we need to really begin to form a new way of thinking about these things. So, other people understand cultural diplomacy. We all understand it in this room, I'm sure. We just need to begin to articulate and formulate those responses in the right way. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I was even, when he was speaking before, I was wondering, is this the Azul that I know that is very straightforward? I think he actually hit the nail on the head with the last French Cultural Center thing. Thank you very much, sir. In the absence of any other question, we want to just appreciate the panelists. Dr. Vincent, thank you very much for your time. We're grateful. Mrs. Kofo, we are very grateful for your time. And of course, Mr. Azu, we're very grateful for your time. Thank you very much. Let's invite Mr. Oliver.
Thank you very much. Mr. Peter Okoto, we're also thankful for your time as well. We just stay for pictures after this. Yes. So let me just say some thank yous. It's been over 3 hours now, and I haven't seen anyone get up to leave. I mean, someone went to use the restroom, but that was it. And it just tells you how invigorating and necessary this subject is. Emotions have run high, just like Azu has been able to give a counter opinion, so I'm very happy with that. It's very important that we understand that it's a discourse, and at the same time, I think it's a way of building cross-cultural relations. I know that for me, it's particularly important because it has even made our sense of history even richer. Colonialism itself, even with its ills, has enriched our art. When you think about the fact that our art is a hybrid of Western techniques and conventions and our own indigenous traditions, and little wonder that Nigerian art is really hot right now. So I don't want us to get emotionally high, especially when at the same time we still do business and we still frequent most of these museums and galleries all around the world. It is very important, and we're very happy as contemporary artists when our works do extremely well with staggering prices on the international art market. So I think it's a symbiosis, and it's something that is a beneficially mutual relationship. Presently, it's time for us to build cross-cultural ties and move forward, as we promote our rich cultural heritage. So with that, I'll say a thank you first to all the speakers, Professor Dan Hick, Princess and Professor Weju Laiwola, panelists Azu Wambogu, Kofo Adeleke, Vincent Hiribaron. I hope I got that right this time. That's my best French accent. And performance artist Jalili Atiku. Of course, the brilliant audience, our partners, the Society of Nigerian Artists, Alliance Française, Center for Contemporary Art Lagos, Oyinda Fakeye is here. The Jalili Atiku Foundation, thank you, Mr. Atiku. Tough Resources, Mr. Tunde Arogomati is here. Wildflower, Austin Array is here. And of course, my team at Omenka, led by Ladu Ogidon. There's also Shalewa Gaji, Ebenezer Okike, Ebu, Ekini Ronye, Emmanuel Wachuku, Jemima, my sister is here, Neka. And please remember that every last Tuesday of every month, we will converge here again for yet, another very interesting and invigorating topic. God bless you all, and thanks for coming.